Hi, CPUS history students. This week we're going to wrap up Reconstruction, so I'll do part two of the notes on Reconstruction, dip in a little bit deeper, and bring Reconstruction all the way up to the end. So, Reconstruction brought some drastic changes to the South. Ultimately, the South originally was very agricultural, and now what you're going to see is during Reconstruction, the South is going to become more industrial. You'll see more manufacturing. You'll see various different types of mills being created. Um, and this new industrial economy in the South is going to require new workers. It's also going to require that railroads be repaired and built and ultimately connect the South. So, what you'll see is this idea of the new South being created, leaving the Civil War behind them and moving forward in this new, stronger direction. So, during this time, all states will be readmitted into the Union. And you'll also see the passage of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. The 13th Amendment in 1865, getting rid of slavery. The 14th Amendment, extending citizenship to African Americans, and that you cannot be denied denied rights, life, liberty, or property without the due process of law. And that'll now be extended to African Americans. And then the 15th Amendment guaranteeing voting rights. You can't be denied the right to vote based upon your race. I will talk about in a minute the fact that they were able to deny them through other means. So Reconstruction was difficult to maintain as Democrats slowly took back control of the southern states. And ultimately what they're going to do is they're going to create different laws and conditions in the South that will ultimately keep the African Americans from becoming full members of society. So Southern governments resisted Reconstruction by passing more discriminatory black codes. Black codes restricted blacks from serving on juries, testifying against whites in court, marrying whites, or owning land. So you create these laws that will keep the African Americans separate from society. And it will restrict black workers. They won't be able to rise to a higher level in society. Black men could be forced into slavery as punishment for a crime or for not paying back their debts. What we'll also see during this time is the Supreme Court is going to be dealing with a lot of cases that have to do with these laws now being put into place. You can see these two cases right here dealing with the 14th Amendment, and then this one dealing with the 15th Amendment. Also during this time, you'll see the rise of the Ku Klux Klan, also known as the KKK. This group is going to be significant in terms of keeping blacks in a position where they can't rise in society. And ultimately, the KKK is going to be something that is going to keep whites in a higher position than blacks throughout the South during this time and moving forward for quite a bit. Now, one of the more difficult things is the fact that the KKK would do things like lynching. Ultimately, what they would do is they would take an African American and they would basically hang them from a tree. And that became more common during this time. And you can see in this image down in the bottom left that it was, it turned into a real big spectacle. But obviously, absolutely terrible treatment of African Americans. Southerners supported the return of Democratic Party to the state government. So we see a shift from Republican rule to Democrat rule. And part of that is because of the black codes and the KKK limiting black voting. And federal troops in the southern military districts really had a difficult time protecting blacks. So we'll see the shift from Republican now to Democrat control during this time. The Civil War ended slavery, but African Americans had little job training or money for farmland. Ultimately, what's going to happen is most ex-slaves are going to return back to plantations to do work there. What's going to happen during this time is you're going to see the rise in what is known as sharecropping. And you can see this cycle here starting with one in the top, on the top in the middle. Sharecropper is provided land and seed. In exchange, he promises landowner half of the crop. Now, the sharecropper is going to need more than just land, so he's going to buy food and clothing on credit from the landowner's store. They'll plant their crops and harvest in number 3. They'll give their landowner crop to sell, and he'll get to keep half of the earnings minus the cost of his purchases. When the settling up, oftentimes the landowner would say the sharecropper owes more than he had earned, and then in order to pay off his debt, the sharecropper would have to essentially restart this cycle over again. So the whites landowners would rent parcels of their field, and then the expectation would be that they would be paid back over time. So by the end of 1865, most freedmen had returned back to the same plantations in which they were previously enslaved. And you can even see that sharecropping is going to remain in place for quite a while, even all the way up until the 1940s. So the Democratic Party returns to power in the South, and the only thing protecting blacks were federal troops, if they could. So in the 1876 election, the two candidates, the Democrat Tilden and the Republican Hayes, neither one of them won a majority of the vote. So what happens is there is a deal known as the Compromise of 1877, in which the Democrats agreed to vote for Hayes if troops were removed from the South. Once the troops would be removed from the South, that's officially what's going to end Reconstruction. So you have these plans in place. The South, the southern states are readmitted. You have this creation of a new society in the South that's more industrial, while also maintaining the agricultural supports that were in place. A lot of the African American former slaves essentially are going to return to working on a lot of those plantations. And then ultimately life is going to be kind of return to this status quo, with slavery now being outlawed, but a lot of the agricultural supports back in place. So Reconstruction era ends, and then what we see of the creation in the South as known as the Jim Crow era. Jim Crow laws segregated Southern society and restricted blacks from voting with poll taxes and literacy tests. And ultimately, you see this separate society. In this bottom right image, you see the white water fountain, which is a considerably larger machine. And then on the right side, you see it's labeled as colored, and that is the drinking fountain that African Americans could drink from. One of the big things that is created during this time are separate schools. And separate schools are going to stay, or segregated schools are going to stay in the South until they get outlawed. And 1954 is actually when they were outlawed, and schools would be desegregated and the schools would be merged together. So your work for this week, little bit heavier lifting than maybe usual. So you watch this video. There's chapter 12, section 2 textbook questions. Then you have an assignment on the Reconstruction amendments. You guys did the 13th last week. This talks about the 13th, 14th, and 15th. And then there is a crash course that I would like you guys to watch. He'll go in a little bit more depth into some of these things that I've discussed, and I'd like you guys to answer the questions that I've attached to the assignment. All right. So good luck. Have a great week. We have a Zoom Wednesday at 12 if you would like to attend. It's a good place to come check in. Let me know how things are going. Certainly, if you have questions, you can ask them then, or you can always email me. All right. Have a great week, guys.